Hi everyone, welcome to episode 5 of the Startup Playbook Hustle, a new segment of the podcast where I interview some of the best up-and-coming startups and founders on their journey, lessons, and challenges to date. My guests for this episode are Heidi Holmes and Lucy Lloyd, the co-founders of Mentorloop, which provides mentoring software that enables businesses to match their people into effective mentorships at any scale, saving them time and improving mentoring outcomes. Lucy and Heidi were recently accepted into and went through the highly competitive Startmate accelerator program and announced a partnership with the Australian Olympic Committee. The success and growth of Mentorloop has allowed them to raise $1 million of funding from a number of investors including Blackbird Ventures, Rampersand, and Tempest Partners. In this episode, we talk about how to get buy-in from your first few customers, passing the hurdle test, finding a technical co-founder versus outsourcing development, and a detailed breakdown of Mentorloop's fundraising process. Without further ado, here is my interview with Heidi Holmes and Lucy Lloyd. Hi, Heidi and Lucy. Welcome to the Startup Playbook Hustle, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show today.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. So Lucy and I have kind of come to Mentorloop together first from being friends. So we actually went to school together over 20 years ago, but found ourselves having a chat over a glass of wine a few years back, and that's where I guess Mentorloop first came about, and that was through I guess both our own experiences through our careers at that point. So I'd actually had another startup prior to Mentorloop called Adage, which was a job board for mature age workers, and it was through that experience that I sort of first saw this talent pool of knowledge sitting on the sidelines, people who wanted to actively engage in the community but didn't have a way to do that outside of employment as well. And at the same time, I'm ex-KPMG, so I'd gone into this startup and it's a little bit lonely as a sole founder, and my network was limited to knowing people within professional services context. So I was looking to connect with sort of a mentor in one regards that had sort of startup experience but didn't have that exposure in my network. So I could sort of see that there was this latent knowledge bank sitting out there, but there was no way to kind of connect. So I was, sort of relaying this to Lucy, and I'll hand over to her.
All right, so my background, obviously, as Heidi mentioned, we went to school together. I went into digital, so I kind of fell into tech agencies, development agencies, a little bit of SEO, stuff like that. And so when Heidi and I had this conversation, I was working for digital agencies, I was working with companies to build kind of online or cloud-based solutions for their business problems. So when Heidi kind of mentioned mentoring, I could immediately see how we could get a minimum viable product up really easily. And so I also had just moved back to kind of from London, so I was having my own problem kind of navigating the local kind of digital scene. And so we kind of, felt that there's always these periods of transition that people go through in their lives, and that's when you need a mentor. You need that future version of yourself to take you by the hand and help you, navigate the unknown, basically. So that's where the idea came from. We started doing research, so we started speaking to organisations and individuals and things like universities who were running mentoring programs, and so a lot of the time they were using spreadsheets and emails to do it, so there was this admin burden, but they were also not getting great results or didn't even know what kind of results they were getting. So the mentors and mentees were a little bit like kind of, they'd be matched, but then the relationships were left to wither on the vine. So we built the first iteration of the Mentorloop product to solve that problem, basically to solve the admin burden, but also improve outcomes in mentoring relationships.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that the idea for Mentorloop kind of came about after having a glass of wine together, which I feel, honestly, I feel like that's where most of the best ideas really come from, but they often get left there as well. So it often gets left at, wouldn't it be great if we kind of built something and then the next day you sort of go on with your lives? What was that sort of process like from that initial conversation into like the next few days? And when did you realise that there was a real business behind Mentorloop?
Yeah, I was already in a startup. I was already in there. I'd already taken that leap. And so for me, it was around that first business I had. There are a lot of learnings I had from that one around what not to do, or more importantly, what to do better next time. And one of those things for me was go into it with a co-founder that has a complementary skill set. So tick. you know. But then I think from there it was a realisation, you know, in conversations post that night that, you know, Luce was looking for that next challenge in her career. So there was another sort of discussion about, you know, are we doing this? And then from there, actually, one of the things we sat down and did early on was actually give our business a name. And it wasn't about getting fancy logos done and getting business cards done. It was more about, we just need to give this a name so it's real, and it's something that we then, it doesn't fade into the background. You know, it was alive and breathing at that point in time. And then, yeah, I think for me that was actually a really pivotal moment.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think there was a while, like, I mean, I guess the first thing was it just wouldn't go away. You know, it kind of captured our imagination, this dating site for mentoring relationships. So it wasn't something we were wanting to let go of, because we're kind of like, someone's going to do this and they're going to do it really soon if we don't do it. But the other thing was, I remember, like, in the early days, I would call it our project. So we're working on this project together, and I remember once being at a barbecue and Heidi was at the same barbecue, and I would kind of describe to someone, so we're doing this thing, that we've got this project we're working on, and then Heidi kind of pulled me aside and said, you need to start calling it a business. Like,
oh, so wise.
So obviously you had the idea and you knew that there was something there, and as you mentioned, it was something that wouldn't really go away. What was that first kind of iteration that you took to market, and where did you sort of draw the line? You know, again, I have so many conversations with startup founders, especially in a B2B context, that are really afraid of putting something that isn't perfect in front of their first client. So what did that first version look like, and when did you know it was the right time to start approaching people?
We started approaching people first. So the first conversations we had to find out how people were running mentoring programs were our first kind of client engagement. So we were kind of like, if we could build this, would you use it? If we could build this, would you use it? And I think we kind of did this organically more than anything else. But I guess what drove us to do it this way was neither of us can code, like neither of us is a developer. So we needed to, you know, reach into our pockets and put our own money in. So the initial bit was like $7,500 each. We put $15,000 together and we said, okay, well, what are we going to use this for? And then in speaking to potential customers, we built out a functional spec. And that first functional spec was really just about removing the admin burden for the program coordinators. And the reason we did that was because they're the ones who had the most pain, like the biggest pain point to solve, and they're the ones who have a budget to spend. So we went for that program coordinator as the client, and then we built a spec, you know, for what a product would look like that would solve their problems. And so the early platform was really just like a really simple CRM almost for mentoring relationships, and it had a little bit of kind of communication between mentor and mentee, but the mentor-mentee side was really, really loose.
And can I just add in there, I think, you know, those conversations we had early on with those potential pilot customers, it was very much a conversation around, yes, if we could build something, would you use it, but will you use it as well? Like, so we kind of had commitment that, and it wasn't about a paying engagement, it was even just, you know, it's hard to just get somebody to use your product at that point without even paying for it, you know, so it was very much around getting that buy-in at that point and selling that vision then. And one of those clients actually is still a client today now, and one of our best ones. So I think that was an important communication piece early on.
Yeah, that's amazing retention, obviously. But, you know, again, like, commitment can be really hard to measure. I've seen startups go out and do surveys from people. And often when you do surveys, you know, for the most part, I don't think people ask the right questions, which gives you sort of imperfect data around particular things. But so you mentioned that you didn't get people to necessarily pay up front, but how did you know that someone was committed enough to using the product if you had built it?
Well, I think you do have that verbal commitment to a certain extent, but you're also not going in where you're building out and going all in where we didn't put $50,000 of our own money in here. And I think there's still an element of risk in this game. Like, you've got to be prepared to, you know, otherwise if it was easy, everyone would go and do it. So you've got to be prepared to put your hand in your own pocket, and you've got to make some assumptions sometimes as well. So for me, it was around backing ourselves, that actually we did know that this problem existed. We weren't fully reliant on just taking what the potential customers said. Customers also don't necessarily know what they don't know. So this was also an opportunity to put our flavour into it, to build it into a product that actually would appeal to them. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. I mean, I'd also say, kind of almost back to that previous question, like it was a really shit product. Like that first iteration, it was just a nightmare to use. It was slow, it was buggy, it was just the worst. And that was the validation then, because we had 3 beta clients who didn't pay but used it. And the fact that they used it despite how awful it was a huge bit of validation for us. So then again, we reached into our own pockets and put kind of the next amount of money out to kind of actually fix a lot of the problems that it had with it.
Yeah, I think they call it the hurdle test. Like if your early customers are willing to jump over hurdles and still use your
I didn't know it had a name.
Yeah. Then, you're onto something.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of then building out the product, did you look to outsource that, or did you look to bring in an internal CTO?
At that point, we had a couple of conversations now that I go back to see were there any developers, because I'd worked with a lot of devs, so were there any developers in our network who we could potentially bring on as a technical co-founder? And it just never worked out. It was just never quite right. And it's got to be a really special person, but they've also got to really love you and believe in your vision. Like it's just a match that is really hard to make. So we worked with a dev agency here in Melbourne called Common Code, and we've now kind of got a 5-year relationship with them. So we worked with those guys when we started with them. They were like 4 dudes in a garage, and now they're like 30 strong. So we've both kind of grown together over the years, and so they were our dev agency.
Fantastic. Well, was there anything, again, there are no shortage of dev agencies, and especially when you're non-tech founders, I guess you had a bit of a technical background and you'd worked with developers before, but were there anything, I guess, for anyone that's looking for a CTO or looking to outsource their development, what are the things that they should look for to make sure that they're bringing on the right person?
The way we approached it, and this is the way I do it again, is have your initial spec should be as tight as it can possibly be. Sometimes you will find awesome dev agencies that can help you to tease out, your exact client requirements, but hopefully you're holding on to as much of those skills as possible to kind of understand. Like we did our own wireframing and stuff, so we wrote out a functional spec.
As in you mean you did?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So we wireframed it. It didn't look exactly like what we wireframed, but we mapped out every interaction in the platform and then took it to devs. And so we probably got quotes from kind of 4 agencies, so ranging from quite large established ones through to just 2-guy teams. And Common Code impressed us with the way they kind of replayed our requirements back to us really nicely. The way they recommended a particular tech and kind of stuck with it, and were able to kind of share with us all the reasons why that particular, it's Meteor, it's a JavaScript framework, but why that particular framework was the right one for us at that time. And helped us to kind of, I guess, we didn't know the phrase minimum viable product at this stage, but because of our kind of constraints in terms of budget, that was our kind of, our philosophy was very lean. And so they kind of replayed that back to us as well, which was nice. We could just kind of recognise that they were looking for, that we didn't necessarily have to build the perfect product, we just needed to build something to prove that we could go to the next stage.
Fantastic. And did you find, obviously, there's been a lot of talk in terms of the investment community and how they view sort of building out tech products without necessarily having those skills in-house, and how that can be really challenging. You recently went on to raise funding from 3 VCs, all with fantastic reputations. How did you find the sort of fundraising process with that additional sort of constraint? Was that a barrier to you, or how did you find that sort of process overall?
Well, because last year we raised what we've now we called it seed then, but we've rebranded it as our pre-seed now. So we raised 300 grand last year, and then this year we've raised 725. So I think last year it was more of a challenge, and we raised from kind of friends, family, and fools with a couple of angels last year. So we had a lot of doors closed on us, and I think it was just at a glance like, these 2 girls are having to pay, these external developers X per month, like it just doesn't look like a very good bet. Whereas this most recent round, we had the traction, we had everything else in line, kind of the traction and I guess the tenacity and the proof that we kind of weren't going anywhere, to allay those fears. But I can see why those fears, you need cash. Like Heidi and I ended up putting kind of in something like 60 to 75 grand of our own money to get Mentorloop to where it could actually be used by clients. So it's not a cheap thing to do as well.
I guess given the choice, would you go down that same path, or would you sort of ideally look to bring on someone internally?
No, I mean, I think...
Same path.
Yeah, take the same path again. I mean, maybe there's little things along the way that you might do a bit differently. Maybe we have now bought tech in-house. Ideally you'd say maybe we would have liked to have done that earlier, but really, how much earlier could we have gone? It's a cost constraint too, so... I think given the resources we had, the path we took was the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think it would have been, we could have spent all our lives looking for the right technical co-founder and never found them. And, it was only once we were able to demonstrate the traction that we did and get the raise that we did, or the raises, that we were able to attract the CTO that we wanted.
That's a really interesting point, because I think that's, again, often gets overlooked. It's like, I've got a great idea. Why can't I find a technical co-founder? Why don't they sort of exist? And a lot of it is, especially from a development point of view, if you're talented, like with anything, there's so much demand for you these days. Like, why would they go and jump in an idea when they can, work on an equally interesting idea that's really taking off with a good pay packet and some form of stability? So you really have to think about it from the other perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think we came to this realisation this week when we had to give a presentation back to one of our investors in their investment community around just articulating that we're at a position now where at the start of this year we were a founding team of 2. We now have 9 employees, but we've been able to attract talent. And it's not just because of the raise, but it's actually because these individuals believe in what we're doing. And so Mark, our CTO as well, is now coming to the table about challenging, some of the assumptions we've made about mentoring. Like, he really buys into what we're doing. And that's what you need in that technical lead as well. It can't just be about shipping code. Like, they actually have to understand the problem you're solving and believe in it.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say about our CTO is that we knew him for 2.5 years, before we were able to get him onto the team. So it's also, it'll take a while as well.
Yeah, with my last startup, Matt was one of my best friends from high school growing up, and it took me forever to convince him to come and join the team as well. So obviously you went through the Startmate program as well recently. What was that experience like for you?
It was phenomenal. So for us, as Heidi said, the start of this year, it was just the 2 of us. So Startmate came with an injection of cash, so they invest, and it was 75 grand. So that allowed us to kind of fast forward some hires that maybe would have taken us longer. So we hired a first internal dev and our kind of marketing growth person. We moved up to Sydney, so it was actually good to kind of, for me to take myself out of my real life for a little while and just focus 100% on the business. And then the other thing is it's a mentor-driven accelerator, and so it was kind of, it not only helped us to, I guess we could navigate mentor relationships quite well because we've got a lot of experience in that, but also it taught us a lot about kind of what great mentoring looks like. So it was an amazing experience. And I think, to go back to your point about, is it hard to raise investment if you're non-tech? I think if we'd been kind of sight unseen approaching these VCs, if they didn't know us from a bar of salt, then that would have been a bigger barrier. But once they kind of got to know us better via Startmate, because, Rampersand and Blackbird both have connections into Startmate, I think when they could see us operate, I think that allayed some of, what might be not quite natural fears. They were able to see how we actually worked on our business.
Yeah, and obviously it's not easy getting into the Startmate program as well. So the fact that you guys were selected is a pretty big sort of tick of approval from.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Yeah.
So speaking of mentoring, and obviously given your startup as well, what does good mentoring look like to both of you?
Look, I think this is one thing that we've really learnt through our journey, is that mentoring is many different things, and it doesn't need to be as prescriptive as this is what it needs to look like, which I think maybe 30 years ago it was a very hierarchical relationship. And I think now mentoring can play out in a number of different ways that can be hugely valuable as well, whether it's a long-term sort of relationship where you're having regular check-ins and there's a certain rhythm to it, to sort of ad hoc mentoring where it's somebody that's in your network that you just pick up the phone and talk to every 6 months. But I think the most valuable mentorships are those where it is kind of, you do have that sort of mentor kit or that personal advisory board where you have different people that you can go to over time, that's what rounds you out as, you know, a more successful founder or person, or, you know, drives your career. I don't think looking at mentoring as, you know, one person's going to be the silver bullet to all your problems is how to look at it, which is maybe how it was sort of 30 years ago.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd add that we've found peer mentoring or near peer mentoring to be one of the most kind of biggest impacts for us this year. So when you've got a senior mentor who may be like 10 years ahead of you, has had a huge exit and, you know, knows it all kind of thing, they're an awesome person to kind of inspire you and be a cheerleader. When you're dealing with like day-to-day crap that you deal with as a founder, you actually want someone who went through it 3 months ago, you know, so they can still have insight about kind of, these were the 5 ways I could have gone. I went this way, but that still might not be the right way, but this is the way I weighed up that decision. And so we find that peer conversation can actually be much more impactful sometimes for how you actually change your operations.
Absolutely. And I mean, we were speaking about this just before we turned on the mic as well. It's the exact same reason why I started the Hustle series as well.
Yeah, this is mentoring.
Absolutely. This is mentoring on scale. I guess playing that out a little bit further then, you know, looking back to what it was like for you probably 2 years ago when you first started, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out and looking to kind of make inroads and turn that idea that they've just had over a drink into a business?
Yeah. Look, I think, you know, we were sort of dabbling around the sidelines, sort of both working on the business part-time, and then once we made the commitment and went full-time, I think there was just a change in attitude and also obviously just outcomes, you know. So I think, you know, what I'm seeing now is people straddling two worlds, like trying to hold on to, you know, their job and do this on the side. I think that's difficult. I think you need to be all in, particularly if you then want to go and ask other people for money. Like, you know, if you're not all in, then why would somebody want to put their hand in their pocket? So I think for us, you know, moving into the business full time and backing ourselves, that, you know, you need that pressure on yourself early on to, you know, pick up the phone, make some sales, get some shit happening.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, I think actually, and, you know, I hope this is okay that I'm saying this, but I think when Heidi and I were going through that process of are we or aren't we, it was probably the most kind of, I mean, it wasn't tension, but it was probably the most friction we've had as founders, was when we were kind of like, you know, are we, aren't we? You know, we both kind of, Heidi had another business, I had a kind of full-time job, and we were just, you know, we couldn't kind of be satisfied with how much we were each able to give the business, and that was probably the worst time as founders we went to. And so what we did was we took the decision to do that kind of out of our own hands by opening the funding round, and we kind of thought, well, if we can raise like a minimum of 200 grand, then it's time to go all in and it's time to do this thing. So that was good because that kind of removed the tension from the decision, and then it was just like single-mindedly, can we raise this money? And then that's what triggered us.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess I wouldn't, again, we wouldn't do it differently. I think, you know, you've got to validate your idea, and the only way to do that, you know, I mean, the safest way to do that is while you've got another job, but you've got to speak to customers, and I guess you need that idea validation before you raise. I guess the other thing is there's so much press about raising, and we had a bit of press a couple of weeks ago, and I was conscious that I kept talking about the right way to raise, and I never once said, but you don't have to raise, you know, like, and that's, I think, a message that needs to get out there. We did raise because we felt like there was an opportunity we were going to miss, but, you know, that doesn't have to be the same way for everybody.
Yeah, and that, you know, and then this is sort of going beyond that original question, but just on that raise part, like, I don't think anyone's raise looks the same across the business either. Like, ours is very unique. We call ours the party round because, like, there's 3 VCs. We raised 725, so that's unusual. Like, for these VCs to sort of, you know, take small chunks in around, as well as some angels. But we love all of our investors on board, and we wouldn't have it any other way. So, but that's probably unique. You know, other people might get whole chunks of what they're looking to raise from one, you know, lead investor. So there's been learnings along the way with, you know, how we've had to sort of hustle to bring a raise together, but that's all our business is just hustle everywhere. For customers, you know, attracting talent, raising money, it's always a hustle.
That's a nice tie-in with the title of the podcast as well, Heidi.
Subtly remarketing to people, I love it. So again, most people find it really difficult to find one investor that will put money in. You've had sort of multiple parties sort of interested. Again, any advice to anyone who's thinking about or currently going through that process at the moment in terms of what they should know or look out for that potentially isn't the more standard, obvious advice that they get?
Well, maybe if I can just go like quite specific about how we ran the rounds, like because we started having conversations 6 months out, and so we basically played a volume game. So we just kind of, there's actually a spreadsheet now. That Airtree put that spreadsheet together of all the angels and VC and stuff. So we didn't have a spreadsheet. We had a Trello board, and it was basically just first round. It was just Melbourne centric. So it was just kind of either their angels, their high net worths, or their family offices, or their VCs. And so we just met everybody, or tried to get a meeting with everybody. Once we'd kind of done that once, we had a shorter list of people that we'd kind of gelled with, or we felt that we'd really love to have on board. At that point, we wrote a letter and had kind of a 2-page kind of. It's not a prospectus because it had no financials because we didn't. Exec summary is what we called it, and it was quite graphically done. It was quite, it was kind of supposed to catch the eye. It was more like an infographic kind of thing about Mentorloop, and we sent the letter and that out to take expressions of interest by a certain date, and then once we got the expressions of interest, we shared a longer deck and financials, and then we had the round. So we probably had like 200 meetings, and then 40 people we sent the expressions of interest to, and then 14 investors at the end. So, it's not for the faint-hearted. And look, I've spoken to founders who do have 2 meetings and raise a round, but I mean...
and we hate it.
Yeah.
No, and also, before going right back to the beginning, it makes me think, after that, the conversation, and then, scoping out wireframes and doing all of that, we also had a conversation with a VC at that point. But we approached them not around, we want a meeting with you because we're raising money. We want a meeting with you because we just want to know what we need to look like in 2 years' time for you to write a check for us at that point. And they were more than happy to take that meeting, So I think, if you're always going out there and the expectation is you're wanting someone to write a check or give you money, then, you're going to miss out on having just, some useful conversations as well. So, plan up to your raise about building relationships with these investors, because they are investing in you as a founder, so they need to get to know you, and they need to see a bit of the journey for early stage investing as well. So I think that's not only a smarter play, but it's also a way for you to get insight into what's their investment ethos and what's their appetite for the type of business you're building, because they just might not ever invest in the type of business you are. That was something else that just sort of...
Yeah, I guess one of the common fallacies of raising investment is you have one meeting with someone and they just pull out the checkbook and wire you the money the next day. It's all about, I think it was Mark Susser that said that it was, investors invest in lines, not dots. And it's part of that building the relationship and them getting to know you and understand you. And as you mentioned earlier, just knowing that you're not going away with this.
And look, that was Rampersand that we had a meeting with, 3 years ago, and they came in on this last round. So that was them. Yeah.
So going back to your earlier point as well about deciding to make that leap if you had raised the 200K as well. I feel that a lot of my friends who are not in the startup space at all, or come from a more traditional background, think that I'm the most I have the biggest risk appetite ever. I think I'm the most risk-averse person to exist on this planet. And I'm actually writing a blog post on why I think entrepreneurs are risk-averse. I just wanted to ask whether that's kind of like a similar thing for you, because I find that a lot of the best founders tend to think a lot, obviously are in it because they think there's a really big upside, but are really conscious and aware of things that can go wrong, but minimize the opportunity for that to happen.
Yeah, I would say that Heidi and I are two of the more risk averse. I mean, I think Heidi is probably more of a natural entrepreneur than I am, so I think her entrepreneurial flair and having started Adage helped me to make the jump. But yeah, I'd say we're both quite risk averse. I mean, we are so tight with money, it's just ridiculous. And, basically our whole world is just modelling stuff in spreadsheets so we can understand all of the different scenarios that might play out, and then deciding on the 5 different ways we're going to react to each one, when they play out. So yeah, I think I agree. I think it's risk averse as well. I mean, there's always a bit of fear when you make that jump, but
of course
it's more fun than anything.
Of course, there's risk, but for us as well, I think it's also about. There's risk in not doing it too, like to a certain extent, So for me, it was just one of those things that I didn't just decide one day I wanted to go and start a business. Like it was sort of, from very early on, I wanted to build up to doing this. So that was around, even what I went and studied, where I went and worked. I had 8 years at KPMG, but I always knew when I was there, I wanted to go and do this one day. So it was building up to this point. And that's why I saved my pennies away so I could go and fund it. So, you're minimising risk always. I think to wake up one day and decide you're going to quit your job and go and do this, that's risky. Like that.
No, absolutely. My own experience was, when I decided to leave, I was like, if this works out, the financial upside is potentially there, but I'm doing something every day that I really like. And what ended up happening was that we didn't end up making it after 3 years, but I was then offered, jobs and paid that I wouldn't have been on had I stayed in a corporate career. So I'm like, literally my downside is I've learned a whole heap. I get offered more money coming back to this as a safety option. Like literally, what is the risk in doing this?
I look at Adage, I had that for 4 years and I had an exit at the end of it, but it wasn't, an exit where I'm sitting on a beach and, doing nothing for the rest of my life. Very much the opposite sort of exit to that. But, my dad said to me at the time, is that this is the cheapest MBA you'll ever have. And it was such an insightful experience. And I think, a lot of entrepreneurs, it's not just one business, there's lots of businesses. And so, and it's not necessarily the first one, might be the second one. Hope it's the second one. But it might be the third, but I think that's the other thing. And it's not to say that, we're already thinking about what the third is. It's definitely much, we're in Mentorloop for a longer play here. But, that's a learning from that first one as well.
So speaking of learnings and everything, what's next? What do the next 2, 3, 4, 5 plus years look like for Mentorloop?
I'm just excited about building this business now. So we're getting out of even that language of talking about Mentorloop as a startup. We've evolved to, we are a proper business now. We have employees, we have monthly commitments we need to meet, we have investors that we need to communicate to and update on, and we have targets we need to meet. So for us, it is about, there's definitely a short-term focus because there's things we just need to be doing monthly. But there's also, and we're having a strategy day next week, but more around, what's the product look like in 6, 12 months, 2 years' time? That's sort of actually what I'm excited about, this next journey.
Yeah, same here. I mean, this year, because it was kind of dominated by the Raise. Before that, it was dominated by Startmate. It's been a very much a startup year, and so now I feel like, but it's also laid the groundwork for us to now give this thing a red hot go properly, without hopefully too many of the overheads that the startup kind of life can bring in. But you never outgrow it. I know I'm probably sounding terribly naive with that comment.
You sound profound.
Well, I mean, part of why I launched this as well was to get almost like an insight and a snapshot into businesses at a relatively early stage as they transition into the process of becoming a business.
Yeah, a real business.
And so really excited to bring you guys back at some point and hear how things are going. But again, something different to finish off with this episode as well is a big part of why I wanted to do this was to help connect and join the dots between the startups that we have on the show and the people that are kind of listening. So if there's one thing that you can ask from people that are listening to help Mentorloop or helps, whether it's hiring or anything in particular, what is it that they can help you out with?
We have one each.
Sure, why not?
I always just ask for a customer introduction. So anyone that is potentially, I guess, the place we typically sell into corporates, into HR, so anyone that has connections into, I guess, senior people leaders within organisations, be it, industry bodies, corporates in particular, universities, that'd be great.
And we are always looking for great people, so in particular around customer success, marketing and development. So anybody who knows any professionals in those areas, we'd love to speak to them.
Fantastic. Heidi and Lucy, thanks so much for coming on the show and for sharing your insights and experiences in building out Mentorloop. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just email us. It's very simple. It's just Heidi@mentorloop.com or Lucy@mentorloop.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure there's links from the show notes.
I won't leave my phone number.
Once again, thanks for coming on the show, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rohit.
Thanks for listening to episode 5 of the Startup Playbook Hustle. You can find the show notes of my interview with Heidi and Lucy, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Want to feature on the Startup Playbook Hustle? Shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co or fill out the form linked onto the show notes available at our website. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 75 of the Startup Playbook podcast next week.